Evelyn Carter adjusted the strap of her sleek black handbag and took a deep breath. The bustling airport terminal was alive with energy. Families reuniting, travelers rushing to catch their flights, and announcements echoing from every corner. Evelyn, dressed in a tailored navy blue pantsuit and low heels, exuded an air of quiet sophistication. Her short, natural curls framed her face, and a gold watch glimmered on her wrist. She carried herself with a calm confidence, a trait she had cultivated over years of navigating spaces where she was often underestimated. As she approached the priority line for first-class passengers, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the curious glances from others in line. She smiled to herself, unfazed. This wasn't the first time people had assumed she didn't belong, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she had learned long ago that her worth wasn't dictated by their opinions. She held her ticket tightly, marked boldly with First Class, as she prepared to check in. Behind the counter, a young agent smiled politely at the passenger ahead of her. Evelyn waited patiently, scrolling through emails on her phone. A few steps away, a uniformed security officer stood with his arms crossed, scanning the area. His name badge read Officer Daniel Hayes, and his sharp gaze stopped when it landed on Evelyn. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to fit her into a box. Evelyn noticed his stare, but chose to ignore it. She was used to such scrutiny, an unspoken question of whether she belonged in certain spaces. She wasn't about to let his assumptions ruin her day. As she moved forward in line, Hayes took a deliberate step closer. His heavy boots echoed on the polished floor. Evelyn caught the shift in the atmosphere, the way his presence suddenly loomed over her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Hayes said, his tone curt and authoritative. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Yes?" "This line is for first-class passengers," he said, emphasizing the words as if she hadn't read the sign. His gaze flickered to her ticket, but his posture made it clear he wasn't convinced. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware of that. That's why I'm here." Hayes' lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me see your ticket." Evelyn handed it over without hesitation, her movements deliberate. She'd seen this play out before, security or staff questioning her presence while conveniently overlooking others in line. Hayes examined the ticket, his frown deepening. "This must be a mistake," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. Evelyn tilted her head. "I assure you there's no mistake." "You need to move to the economy line," Hayes said, louder this time, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Murmurs rippled through the queue, and a few people openly stared. Evelyn could feel their judgment like a tangible weight pressing against her back. "Officer, I've paid for this ticket, and I intend to use it," Evelyn said, her voice steady. She wasn't one to raise her voice unnecessarily, but she also wouldn't let herself be bullied. Hayes stepped closer, his demeanor growing more confrontational. "If you don't move, I'll have to escort you myself." The murmurs grew louder. A man in a crisp business suit scoffed from behind her. "Some people will try anything for a free upgrade," he muttered, loud enough for Evelyn to hear. Evelyn ignored him, focusing on Hayes. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said evenly. Hayes laughed dryly, as if the idea were absurd. "That won't be necessary. This line is for paying first-class passengers." "And I'm a paying first-class passenger," Evelyn replied, her patience thinning. She extended her hand to retrieve her ticket, but Hayes didn't budge. By now, the scene had attracted even more attention. Travelers paused to watch, some pulling out their phones to record. Evelyn could feel the heat of the spotlight, but she refused to let it rattle her. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to remove you from the premises," Hayes said, his tone dripping with condescension. Evelyn's jaw tightened. but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Go ahead," she said, her voice cold. "Make the call." Hayes faltered for a moment, surprised by her composure. He straightened up, motioning for two other security officers nearby. "Escort this woman out," he ordered. Evelyn felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her as the officers approached. She held her ground, her heart pounding, but her exterior unflinching. She had been through worse, and she wouldn't let this moment break her. As they led her away from the priority line, Hayes smirked, clearly pleased with himself. "Next time, don't try to cheat the system," he said over his shoulder. Evelyn didn't respond. She wasn't about to waste her energy on him. Instead, she silently reached for her phone and made a call. "Hello?" she said, her tone calm and deliberate. "It's Evelyn Carter. I need you to handle something for me." Quietly, but effectively. The person on the other end replied quickly, and Evelyn hung up, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that true power didn't need to shout. It simply acted. As she sat in a quiet corner, waiting for what she knew would come next, Evelyn couldn't help but smile faintly to herself. Let them think they've won. For now. Evelyn settled into the stiff airport lounge chair, her hands clasped around her phone. The faint buzz of the terminal filled the air, announcements blaring over the intercom, travelers dragging suitcases across the glossy floors, and the occasional outburst of laughter from nearby cafes. To the casual observer, she might have seemed serene, her posture poised and her face neutral. But beneath the surface, her mind churned. She replayed the interaction with Hayes, analyzing each word and action. It wasn't the first time she had faced such blatant disrespect, but that didn't mean she had grown numb to it. Every microaggression, every assumption, left a scar, no matter how deep it was buried. But Evelyn had learned how to channel that hurt, to turn indignation into action. She wouldn't let Hayes or anyone else define her worth. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. The caller ID displayed a name that brought a flicker of reassurance. Linda Marks. "Linda," Evelyn said smoothly as she answered, her voice betraying no trace of the turmoil inside her. "Evelyn, I just heard. Are you all right?" Linda's tone was sharp with concern, tinged with the kind of urgency that comes from knowing a mistake has been made. "I'm fine," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone measured. "But your team has a problem. A security officer, to be specific." Linda sighed heavily. "I can't believe this. Where are you now?" "In the lounge near Gate 14, Evelyn said. "I'll wait for you here." "Stay put," Linda said firmly. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Evelyn ended the call and set her phone down on her lap. She leaned back, observing her surroundings with a practiced detachment. Nearby, a woman in a floral dress stole glances at her, curiosity evident in her eyes. A man in a business suit, perhaps the same one who had sneered at her earlier, whispered to his companion while shooting her sideways looks. Evelyn met their gazes without flinching, holding them just long enough for discomfort to settle in. Then she looked away, letting the silence between them speak volumes. If they thought she would shrink under their scrutiny, they were sorely mistaken. 10 minutes passed, and Evelyn's surroundings grew noticeably quieter. The usual hum of the terminal seemed to pause, replaced by a curious energy rippling through the crowd. Heads turned as a small group of impeccably dressed individuals strode toward the lounge. At the center of the group was Linda Marks, CEO of the airline, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she moved with purpose. Behind Linda were 2 senior executives and a public relations officer, all of whom wore expressions of concern. Evelyn stood as they approached, her posture regal, her eyes cool but expectant. "Evelyn," Linda said as she reached her, her voice filled with apology, I'm so sorry this happened. Linda, Evelyn replied, her tone cordial but firm. I appreciate you coming. The crowd around them began to murmur. It was clear to everyone now that this was no ordinary passenger. Evelyn was someone important, someone powerful. Linda turned to the PR officer and murmured something. The man nodded and hurried away, presumably to handle the growing audience. Linda then gestured to a private seating area nearby. Shall we sit? She asked. Evelyn nodded, and they moved to the quieter space. Linda's executives remained standing nearby, their faces tight with discomfort. Evelyn noted the tension in their postures, the way they avoided looking directly at her. I've already been briefed on what happened, Linda began once they were seated. Let me assure you, Officer Hayes and the other security staff involved have been suspended pending a full investigation. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and doesn't reflect the values of this airline. Evelyn studied Linda's face carefully. She could see the sincerity in her words, but also the undercurrent of fear. A fear of the consequences this incident could have, not just for the airline's reputation, but for Linda's position as its leader. Linda, Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. This isn't just about me. It's about the systemic issues that allow people like Hayes to act with impunity. A suspension isn't enough. What are you doing to ensure this doesn't happen again? Linda hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. She glanced at one of the executives, who quickly stepped forward. We're implementing immediate sensitivity training for all staff, he said. And we'll be reviewing our hiring practices to ensure we're bringing in personnel who align with our values. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Sensitivity training? Hiring reviews? Those are Band-Aid solutions. This isn't a one-time fix. It's a culture shift. Linda nodded slowly, taking in Evelyn's words. You're right, she admitted, and I want your input on how we can make that shift. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. She had no interest in being a token consultant, brought in for appearances and quickly forgotten. But she also knew the power she wielded as a major investor in the airline. If she demanded change, it would happen. I'll think about it, she said finally, but for now, I'd like to board my flight without further incident. Of course, Linda said immediately. She turned to one of the executives. Ensure Miss Carter is escorted to her gate and given every courtesy. The executive nodded, looking relieved to have a task he could execute without risk of error. As Evelyn stood to leave, she noticed Hayes lingering near the lounge entrance, his face pale and his posture stiff. He looked like a man who had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. Linda followed her gaze and frowned. Daniel Hayes! Linda called out sharply. Hayes flinched and stepped forward reluctantly. He avoided Evelyn's eyes, his earlier bravado replaced by a sheepish demeanor. Apologize, Linda ordered. Hayes swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, ma'am. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, watching as Hayes squirmed under her gaze. I accept your apology, she said finally, but understand this. An apology doesn't erase the harm you've caused. I hope you take this as an opportunity to reflect and grow. Hayes nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. Evelyn turned and walked toward the gate, her head held high, leaving him to grapple with the consequences of his actions. As she boarded the plane, Evelyn felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The wheels of change were turning, and though there was still much work to be done, she knew this was a step in the right direction. Evelyn settled into her first-class seat, her posture as composed as ever. The luxurious leather cradled her, but she felt no comfort. Her mind was still processing the events of the past hour. Though the air around her hummed with the chatter of flight attendants preparing for takeoff, she remained distant. her gaze fixed out the window. From her vantage point, she could see the bustling activity of the airport runway. Planes taxied to their gates, luggage carts zipped back and forth, and workers moved with precision. It was a world of order and coordination, a sharp contrast to the chaos she'd just endured. The flight attendant, a young woman with a polished smile, approached cautiously. "Miss Carter, is there anything I can get for you before takeoff?" Evelyn turned her head slowly, meeting the attendant's eyes. She saw no malice there, only professionalism tinged with nervousness. The woman must have been briefed on the incident, Evelyn thought. Everyone in the airline likely knew by now. "Water, please," Evelyn said softly. The attendant nodded and disappeared. Evelyn sighed, glancing at the tablet in her lap. On the screen was a draft of the keynote speech she was set to deliver at a conference the following day. The topic? Leadership, accountability, and the importance of equity. Ironic, she thought, given the situation she'd just faced. But perhaps it was fitting. Her experience today had only underscored the importance of the message she was preparing to share. As she began editing the speech, her phone vibrated in her purse. She pulled it out and saw a message from David Harper, her personal assistant. "David, just saw the footage online. Do you want me to respond to any press inquiries?" Evelyn frowned, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hadn't realized the incident had already made its way to the internet. The thought made her uneasy. Public attention often muddied the waters, turning genuine issues into spectacles. She typed a quick reply. "Evelyn, no comment for now. Let it simmer. I'll handle it after the conference." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Evelyn leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines grew louder, a steady rhythm that drowned out her thoughts. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to let the tension in her shoulders ease. But the reprieve was short-lived. Her thoughts returned to Hayes, the way he had looked at her, the disdain in his tone, the arrogance with which he had dismissed her. She had seen that look before, in boardrooms, at fundraisers, even in her early days as an investor. It was the look of someone who had decided her worth before she even spoke. But what troubled her more was the system that enabled people like Hayes. His actions were not isolated. They were a symptom of a larger problem. Evelyn knew she had the resources and influence to make a difference, but she also knew the path would be long and fraught with resistance. An hour into the flight, the same flight attendant returned with a fresh bottle of water and a small tray of snacks. "Miss Carter, if there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Evelyn offered a polite nod. "Thank you." As the attendant moved away, the passenger seated across the aisle leaned over slightly. He was a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, his graying hair neatly combed. He held out a hand. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, his voice warm but measured. "I'm Richard Lark, VP of Operations for this airline. I wanted to introduce myself and personally apologize for what you experienced earlier." Evelyn hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Evelyn Carter." "I know who you are," he said with a faint smile. "You've been one of our most significant investors for years. I can't tell you how mortified I was to hear about today's incident." Evelyn studied him, noting the sincerity in his tone. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Lark, but apologies only go so far. The problem runs deeper than one officer's actions." "I agree," he said, leaning back slightly, "and I want you to know that we're committed to addressing it. Linda has already called for an emergency board meeting to discuss structural changes." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Structural changes? That's ambitious. What kind of changes are we talking about?" "Mandatory diversity and equity training for all employees, a thorough audit of our hiring and promotion practices, and a public commitment to better representation in leadership roles," he said. We'll need your support to implement these initiatives. Evelyn considered his words carefully. Support is one thing, she said. Accountability is another. Will these changes be cosmetic, or will they have teeth? Because if it's the former, I'm not interested. Lark nodded, his expression serious. Fair point. I'll make sure Linda knows where you stand. Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Good, because I intend to hold you all to it. As the plane soared above the clouds, Evelyn turned back to her tablet. Her speech, once a collection of polished phrases and theoretical ideas, now felt more personal. She began to rewrite sections, infusing them with the weight of her experience that day. Her opening line took shape. Leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about courage. The courage to see inequities and dismantle them, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Satisfied, she saved the draft and closed her tablet. She glanced out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. It reminded her of the many flights she had taken over the years, journeys that had brought her both challenges and triumphs. This flight, she realized, was no different. Another challenge, another opportunity to rise above. And as the plane continued its journey, so too did Evelyn's resolve to push for change, to demand better, and to ensure that the next time someone like Hayes looked at a passenger like her, they would think twice. The flight landed smoothly, and as Evelyn disembarked, she could feel the weight of anticipation. She had barely stepped off the jet bridge when she spotted a small group waiting for her, just beyond the glass doors of the arrival gate. Linda Marks stood at the forefront, her polished demeanor intact, but her eyes betraying a mixture of determination and unease. Behind her stood Richard Lark, the VP of Operations, and another man Evelyn didn't immediately recognize, tall, with a sharp suit and an air of authority. His badge marked him as the airline's chief legal officer. The trio exuded the kind of energy Evelyn was intimately familiar with: corporate damage control. Evelyn walked toward them with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The bustling crowd around them seemed oblivious to the tension radiating from the small group. "Miss Carter," Linda began, extending her hand, "thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I know this has been an exhausting day for you." Evelyn accepted the handshake, but kept her expression neutral. "Linda, Richard," she acknowledged, then glanced at the third man, Paul Richardson. The man introduced himself, Chief Legal Officer. "I've been brought in to ensure that today's events are handled appropriately." Evelyn's lips quirked slightly. Handled appropriately? That's an interesting choice of words. Linda cleared her throat, stepping in. "We've arranged a private lounge for this meeting, Miss Carter, if you'll follow us." Evelyn nodded, saying nothing as she followed them through the terminal. They entered a sleek, glass-walled conference room adjacent to the airline's executive lounge. A tray of refreshments had been set up: bottled water, neatly arranged fruit platters, and a pot of freshly brewed coffee. Evelyn ignored it all, taking a seat at the head of the table. Linda and her team sat across from her, their postures stiff. Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch, letting them feel the weight of her scrutiny. Finally she spoke. "Well," she said, her tone even, "let's hear it." Linda leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table. "Evelyn, I want to start by reiterating how deeply sorry we are for what you experienced today. Officer Hayes's actions were completely unacceptable, and I assure you they do not reflect the values of this airline." "I've heard that line before," Evelyn said, her voice cool. "Values are meaningless without enforcement. So tell me, Linda, what's going to change?" Linda glanced at Richard, who took the cue to speak. "We've already initiated an internal review of our policies and procedures, particularly around staff training and customer interactions. Hayes and the other officers involved have been suspended pending a formal investigation. That's a start, Evelyn said, but it's not enough. We know that, Linda replied quickly. That's why we're proposing a more comprehensive plan. Paul Richardson, the legal officer, leaned forward. We're prepared to implement mandatory training for all employees, not just on diversity and inclusion, but on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. Additionally, we're revising our hiring practices to prioritize diverse candidates and reviewing our promotion criteria to ensure equal opportunities. Evelyn listened, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she let the silence linger again before speaking. You're proposing systemic changes, she said. That's good, but systemic change requires accountability. Who's going to ensure this isn't just another corporate PR exercise? Linda hesitated, glancing at Paul, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Evelyn continued. Do you know how many times I've heard promises like this? She asked, her voice steady but sharp. And do you know how many of those promises result in real, measurable change? Very few. If you want my support, I need more than words. I need commitments, tangible, enforceable commitments. Richard cleared his throat. Miss Carter, as one of our most influential investors, your input is invaluable. We're open to your guidance on how to structure these changes. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Guidance? Let's be clear. I'm not here to do your job for you, but I will set my expectations. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. First, I want quarterly reports on the progress of these initiatives, not just vague updates, concrete metrics, hiring data, promotion rates, employee feedback. Second, I want an independent oversight committee to monitor these changes, not an internal team that answers to you, but an external group with the authority to hold you accountable. Linda nodded slowly, her expression serious. We can do that. Third, Evelyn added, her tone sharpening, I want the board to issue a public statement acknowledging what happened and committing to these changes. Transparency matters. Richard and Paul exchanged uneasy glances, but Linda nodded again. Consider it done. And finally, Evelyn said, leaning forward, I want assurance that people like Hayes will no longer have the power to humiliate and demean others. Not just through training, but through meaningful consequences. If you fail to deliver on any of these points, I'll withdraw my investment. The room fell silent. Linda's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. Evelyn, we understand the gravity of your concerns, and we're committed to meeting them. You have my word. I'll hold you to that, Evelyn said. The meeting concluded with firm handshakes and a renewed sense of purpose. As Evelyn left the conference room, she felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction at having forced accountability, but also a lingering frustration that such efforts were still necessary in the first place. As she walked through the terminal, heads turned. Passengers whispered, some recognizing her as the woman from the earlier incident. Evelyn ignored them, her focus already shifting to the work ahead. Outside, her driver was waiting with the car door open. Evelyn slid into the back seat, her mind racing with ideas for her speech. Today's events had given her new material. Raw, real, and powerful. Leadership wasn't just about being in charge. It was about using power to lift others, to challenge systems, to demand better. And Evelyn Carter wasn't about to let this opportunity pass. As the car pulled away from the airport, Evelyn glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold. This was just the beginning. She had the power, the influence, and the determination to make a difference. And she intended to use it. The conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Rows of seats stretched across the grand ballroom, filled with a diverse audience of industry leaders, policymakers, and young professionals eager to learn from the best. The air carried a mixture of excitement and reverence. This was not just another corporate event. Evelyn Carter's keynote address was the highlight of the day, a beacon for those seeking guidance on leadership, equity, and accountability. Backstage, Evelyn stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the lapel of her blazer. The navy blue fabric, tailored to perfection, reflected her calm authority. Her assistant, David Harper, hovered nearby, tablet in hand, providing her with last-minute updates. "The media's already buzzing about your appearance," David said, scrolling through headlines. "Investor who confronted airline bias to speak on equity. You've become the face of change overnight." Evelyn glanced at him through the mirror. "Let them talk. Today isn't about me, it's about the message." David smiled faintly, impressed by her focus. "Still, it doesn't hurt to know the world is watching." Evelyn nodded, but said nothing. Her thoughts were elsewhere, mentally rehearsing her opening lines. Today wasn't just another speech. It was an opportunity to turn a personal experience into a call for systemic change. Before stepping onto the stage, Evelyn took a moment to center herself. The events at the airport replayed in her mind, the humiliation, the confrontation, and the quiet power she had wielded to turn the situation around. It wasn't just about Hayes or the airline. It was about the countless individuals who faced similar biases daily, without the resources or platform to fight back. She thought of her late mother, a teacher who had spent her life advocating for marginalized students in an underfunded school district. Her mother had always told her, "You can't change the world by yourself, but you can spark a fire in others." Today, Evelyn intended to do just that. The MC's voice echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, a trailblazer in business and equity advocacy, Ms. Evelyn Carter." Applause erupted as Evelyn stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding the room. She approached the podium, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She took a moment to survey the crowd, meeting their eyes with quiet confidence. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It's an honor to stand before you today." The room quieted, the audience hanging on her every word. "Leadership," she continued, "is a word we hear often. It's a title many aspire to, a role that carries influence. But leadership, true leadership, is not about power. It's about courage. The courage to see inequities and dismantle them, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it may be." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Yesterday, I had the opportunity to witness a stark reminder of why this work matters. I was at the airport, preparing to board a flight I'd paid for, holding a first-class ticket. But to a security officer, my appearance, my very existence, was enough to question whether I belonged." Gasps rippled through the audience. Evelyn saw the mixture of shock and recognition on their faces. For some, her story hit close to home. For others, it was an uncomfortable awakening. "I was told to leave the priority line," she said, her tone calm but piercing. "I was humiliated, dismissed, and treated as though my worth was tied to the assumptions of someone who saw me as less." Evelyn straightened, her voice growing stronger. "But I am not less. None of us are. And it is our responsibility, yours, mine, everyone's, to challenge the systems and attitudes that perpetuate this kind of bias." Evelyn shifted her focus to the broader implications of her experience. The events of yesterday are not unique. They are a symptom of a larger problem, one that exists in boardrooms, schools, hospitals, and, yes, even airports. It's a problem of systemic inequity fueled by unconscious bias and reinforced by complacency. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. As leaders, we cannot afford to be complacent. It is not enough to issue apologies after the fact, or implement surface-level solutions. We must dig deeper. We must hold ourselves and our organizations accountable. The audience sat in rapt silence, her words resonating deeply. Evelyn's voice softened, but lost none of its power. I am here today not just to share my story, but to challenge you. Ask yourself, what biases exist in your organization? What barriers have you ignored because they don't affect you directly? And most importantly, what are you willing to do to change that? As Evelyn concluded her speech, the audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the vast ballroom. Some rose to their feet, their expressions a mix of admiration and resolve. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the exhilaration of knowing her words had landed. Backstage, David waited with a wide smile. "You knocked it out of the park," he said as she approached. "The response online is already overwhelming. Hashtags, articles, videos, it's all happening." Evelyn gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good. Let's keep the momentum going." As Evelyn left the conference hall, she felt a shift within herself. The events of the past 24 hours had been draining, but they had also been empowering. She had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a platform for change, and she wasn't done yet. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Linda Marks. "Linda, the board has approved all your recommendations. We're ready to move forward." Evelyn smiled faintly. Change was never easy, but it was possible. And she would continue to push, to fight, to lead, not for herself, but for everyone who deserved better. As she stepped into her waiting car, she thought of her mother's words once more. "You can't change the world by yourself, but you can spark a fire in others." And spark it she would.